Am I visible and audible?
Yeah, you are visible and audible.
I have really bad net in the hospital right now, so in case I do cut off, please let me know immediately. Right. Hmm. Let me set up my timer. Starting with my speech in three, two, one, and start. Panel, the Biden administration is failing. They probably have the lowest approval ratings since they've all ever had, and the 2024 elections are coming up pretty soon. Why is this important? Understand this because of a few reasons. Firstly, is how when they pulled out of the Afghanistan war. Understand the perception before this was that the US is the say flag bearer of peace, and US say puts democracy in places where they need it. Which means that given that US rule was there in Afghanistan for the longest time, they probably had the idea of, oh, we're protecting the Afghani people. But at a point in time, Biden pulls out of Afghanistan and Taliban takes over. This is a huge PR hit for the Biden administration and their policies, because people now think that Biden pulling out was the reason Afghanistan was taken over, and so much pride that people had in the American army, in the American system, is something that goes away. But secondly, on the idea of Republican backlash on this, which means media capitalized on these facts, and people who probably took pride in the fact that, oh, Afghanistan is something USA is proud of, also now feel that something bad is happening. But also on humanitarian grounds, because of the bad things that are happening, USA is directly liable for this. So that's why people feel this bad, and Biden administration takes a lot of hits for this. But secondly, on the idea of the UK Russia. So secondly, is on the idea of how US is also economically weaker in this position. This happens for a few reasons. First is on the Ukraine-Russia war, right? Understand. Firstly, global supply chains have been disrupted, which means trade becomes harder. Access to oil is now significantly more expensive, which means you probably have to go to alternative sources or probably have to buy oil from more expensive lenders. But secondly, some the idea of most of the NATO investment that you've put in now goes to support Ukraine as opposed to coming back to the United States. But lastly, on the idea of how much money they spent during the COVID-19 crisis in terms of, say, overamping the healthcare system. But at the same time, this also led to a lot of jobs, which means at a point in time, you even have the tech recession going on, and Silicon Valley Bank failure that happened recently. People don't have jobs in the United States, and at a point in time that happens, we think the approval rating further takes a dip because of that. Then understand why, how does probably the Biden administration go ahead and improve this on their paradigm. The most important thing here is to create more jobs, right? And we'll tell you why this exclusively becomes important. At a point in time, this policy was enacted in 2021. People consider this to be the tipping point for why the recession came about, considering the Biden administration had been flaunting about how much money that has been put into education policies and how this is going to help people out in general. Which means at a point in time where they could have been giving money to people to get their jobs back, or probably giving money to people to get their, say, healthcare or, say, emergency ideas, the money was being put here. At a point in time that happens, people feel dissatisfied with this in general. But then understand why this becomes important. First of all, is on the idea of you not being able to push newer education policies further. Because understand, at a point in time when you go ahead and push this policy, probably Republicans can go ahead and say that, oh, you probably have one policy in place and you probably can't put better education policies because they say that, oh, you probably have a policy like this in place. Which means at a point in time that happens, you probably had other student debt remissal programs which aren't being utilized to the fullest extent right now. But understand why this time is exclusively important and why creation of the jobs is important. Blue states and red states usually conflict or fight on most ideas, which means at a point in time where they have bipartisan support is the way you go ahead and show the best sort of effectivity in your government. This is important for the Biden administration because they recently lost the midterm election as well, which means crowd approval of them is bad. What they need is a serious image makeover, and they want to do that fast because they only have 1 year to the coming elections. How do they go ahead and do this? And this is where our counterfactual explicitly comes about and why it's important. Understand. Job creation is our counterfactual. We achieve this in a few ways. Instead of rallying against the Republicans on policies for education or policies where you don't go ahead and match, you probably go ahead and have bipartisan support or bipartisan rallying into, say, funding, putting money into local businesses and having people getting vocationally trained. Because understand, even Donald Trump's idea of how people should be getting jobs and things like this is relevant. And at a point in time that happens, you're probably pushing for more easy vocational jobs for these people at a point in time. Understand why this is important. First is on the idea of time, right? You probably need a lot of time for this policy to come about. At a point in time, money is put here, which means you probably don't get as much approval ratings. And even if you go ahead and say give remittal to some sort of the debt that people have, it's still not enough for these people. Which means these people are still in a relatively worse position, and the fund allocation isn't done to the best extent. But secondly, on the idea of how, say, not going ahead with this policy or probably putting money away from this policy looks like a change of perception. Because at a point in time where you go ahead and have bipartisan support, you can probably claim more impacts and more effectivity of an administration. At a point in time, Biden administration can also effectuate some sort of change in blue states. But lastly, is on the idea, even if you want to go ahead and reallocate this money into education, if options that education policies like that are important, you probably can do two things, right? You probably can let people have more vocational training in general, because that lets them have jobs, and probably that creates more jobs easily. But second is the idea, you can make school systems better by putting out anti-bullying policies, which means even if people go ahead and spend huge sums of money into their schools and things like that, they probably go ahead and drop out because of how difficult it is to stay in schools, given the United States scene with people having, say, bullying policies in school like this at all points in time. Then understand why this is good. The point is that the market in the United States is getting saturated by people who are highly educated. What this policy does is that this lowers the entry barrier into education for a lot of people. This means that at a point in time where you go ahead and let people have education easily, this still doesn't mean that education is easier to have. This just means that you need less money to have this, which means most people still don't have the amount of money required to go ahead and opt into conventional education. This means a few things. Firstly, this means that you probably take more riskier economic decisions in terms of thinking that, oh, education is more accessible to you as an idea. But before that, POI.
Why are subsidies for businesses bipartisan, but subsidies for education not?
Because you want to create more jobs. That's something that's considered more important. Biden policies have already been prioritizing education. At a point in time, this happens, and we think that creating jobs is more important for approval rating. The idea is that education has a gestational period. You probably put money into education, you probably develop infrastructure, facilities, get professors and things like this, which means to effectuate this, you need a lot of time under the belt for you to go ahead and get tangible change out of this. That's time that Biden administration does not have. That is why you probably go ahead and have support for creating jobs. And we think it's clearly Republican policy that you don't prioritize education as much as you prioritize getting jobs. Because understand, if you go ahead and cater to people who are very rich and who probably are the major stakeholders in the Republican Party, you probably go ahead and have these people getting more employees and having their businesses become more efficient, which means Republican people obviously want more labor to come about in the market. But there is on the idea of how this becomes better in the short term, because now understand, given that the market for educated people is oversaturated, you probably don't get as many jobs or don't get jobs as high paying, which means even if you take up massive student debts, you can't go ahead and repay that. At a point in time, your jobs aren't paying well. And to this, as opposed to this, the jobs for vocational market is growing because people increasingly have more capital to spend, which means on the short term, this gives results, but even on the long term, this makes the vocational job market more sustainable for people. And for those reasons, I think the counterfactuals that we provide to you works on the longer term as well, which means increased approval ratings and probably a better chance of election in the future. And for those reasons, we are so proud to propose.
We thank the Prime Minister for that speech. To open up the opposition half, we now call on the Leader of Opposition. Here.
Hi, I just want to check if I'm audible and visible.
Yeah, you are audible and visible.
Okay, cool. I'll take a POI in chat. Sorry, like just wave at me. I won't be looking at chat. Also, don't unmute. I'll take you at about 5. I'll be starting my speech. Sorry. I'll be starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. To cater to your voter base through one of the most fundamental issues, which also just happens to be bipartisan, is a rarity in the polarized nature of Western politics. The PSLF serves as a tool for Biden to rally his voter base and do what they've always wanted to do. My speech will be broken down to 3 parts. First, I'll set up the debate. Second, deal extraneous rebuttals to their counterfactual, and then bring 2 substantive to this debate. First thing, the recession is just not a part of the debate, right? They try to sneak this in. We just don't think this is a real push that comes from them for 4 main reasons. The first is that the US spends upwards of tens, if not hundreds of trillions of dollars. So 42 billion in the grand scheme of things is virtually nothing. It's like, what, 0.42% of 1%, 0.42% is just not a lot. The second is that inflation and recession is still likely to persist, even under Republican office, even if any other policy they're trying to run is still likely to happen because spending still happens. The third is the US doesn't really mind and public ratings aren't going to go down because of the PSLF because people see it as value or like value neutral, right? People find it as like a tool that maximizes utility. Education is likely something that a lot of people can benefit from and it's just deemed as a good thing. It's deemed as a merit good. The fourth is this unlikely to be a tipping point because other welfare policies, even drone strikes, cost a lot of money to make, which means it's unlikely that this is the last straw that breaks the camel's back. Like people considering it to be the tipping point is simply lazy debating from PM at this point. Why backlash against the PSLF is not a problem? First, like I said, education is likely bipartisan in nature. Everybody claims it as a human race, regardless of race, country, or economic platform, and everybody can use it, which means it does not disproportionately benefit any Democrats or Republicans, which also means it's a lot harder for Republicans to come and backlash against these things insofar as like, it's education, you get to use it anyways. A public school is not going to say, you're a Democrat, you can come in, you're a Republican, you can't come in. Rebuttals then. On the job creation counterfactual that they try to push, right? It just can't be their counterfactual because they were meant to prove the likely not alternative, not the possible alternatives that could have been. But even if they did, and I'm being charitable here, first, it's something the Biden administration does currently, so they're still trying to increase jobs. So I don't see this as the counterfactual insofar as it happens anyways. The second is it's also likely to take a lot more money insofar as you're trying to overhaul the entire market to create new jobs. I'd argue that's a lot more risky and takes out a lot more money. Third, they're also likely to focus on SMEs, poor people, and migrant jobs. These things are not bipartisan, which means you give a lot more weaponization ability for these Republicans to come and say, oh, you're not prioritizing us and we can go against these things. So if they're trying to argue on bipartisanship, they fall on that. Fourth, if anything, education just produces jobs as well. They said it's not going to be successful with zero analysis. We can just counter assert that with zero analysis. And what? Presumably there's going to be a vetting process that makes the best use of money that goes into the PSLF. Two arguments then. The first, on stability as an administration. For that, I'll take a PI.
Who do you think are the prime consumers of this loan forgiveness? Do you think it's a core voter base of the Democrats? Why is it unlikely that they won't still vote for Biden regardless?
I think they're students, and students have a lot of voter debt, which I'll explain in my first argument, which is the stability of the Biden administration as a whole. We tell that student loans are a huge burden for students for three structural reasons. The first is that there are a lot of other things that take up their money. Insofar as there are students that are unlikely to have a steady income, which means things like the increased cost of living, the things like unsubsidized medical care in the US, and the increasing housing and gas prices means that their daily living expenses become incredibly more expensive. All these things are necessities, which I argue education is as well, but I don't think government wants to buy that. In these cases, it's likely that these student loans take up a huge amount of their portion of their income or just money they have. The second is also education is likely to define what you are valued as in society. So even if you don't want education, you're forced to want it because society tells you it's good. Society tells you you must be valuable contributor to the economy. If you want to have a good education, society recognizes you as coming from privilege or coming from a higher stand and will recognize and respect you more if you do have that degree you so crave, right? The second is you just need it to be it's just necessary to compete in the economy that is hyper competitive in places exactly like the United States. You need a degree to be even considered for a job interview, and for the people who can't access it without the student loan forgiveness, it's extremely bad for them under side government. But third, also taking student loans are likely to be the people taking these loans are likely to be the most financially vulnerable and also the most vulnerable to expectations. This is precisely why the Biden administration added it as a part of its manifesto, because like the response to the POI, the Democrat voter base is largely of the younger population who face, guess what, student debt. And it's precisely championing the PSLF that got the Biden administration into power in two key ways. The first is among other Democrat candidates, right? Because it's such a pressing issue, it got him a lot of support, which was the determining factor that other Democrat senators elected him as a Democrat representative because it's based on public vote. This means that this has been a key factor in what got him into power to even be running against Trump in the first place. The second, in swing states, due to a somewhat bipartisan nature of the policy of education, is likely to have swung certain states which were crucial in determining its victory. The counterfactual to repeal it, which means there'll be immense backlash from your very voter base, insofar as you've promised to do these things for them, and you're likely to have won a lot of people's trust by doing these things. This means that at its very fundamental level, Biden owes it to the PSLF Biden owes it to the PSLF to be in his seat of power. The very basis of regretting your Trump card, no pun intended, to be in power is something that already loses the debate. Because the moment you regret these things is the moment in which you're voter base turns against you. Backlash matters under our side only because the people backlashing against you are the people who voted for you in the first place. The people who are backlashing education, like subsidized education, are likely to be your Democrats. It's going to be your Republicans who backlash you about anything anyways due to polarization. Second argument then, about how the Biden administration has incentives to pass like center-left moderate socialist policies, right? First, Biden administration has like kind of somewhat socialist policies, things like care about the little guy, things like fighting for migrant rights, things like government subsidies for startups and small, medium enterprises, things like tax relief for poor people, things like racial equality. These things are like the very foundations of the Democratic Party. And we've seen Biden's administration and supporters filled with those who champion welfare policies, things like Kamala Harris championing for racial and gender minority rights, people like AOC, Clinton, and Sanders championing for socialist policies like caring for the poor, making more like healthcare and like housing just more accessible and just promoting welfare in general. What are its implications? This means that if anything blew up, it's likely because if anything blew up, it's likely that the Biden's voter base would still back them. So this is where I flip their POI, right? Because if it's true that voter ratings have gone down for the Biden administration, it's unlikely going to be from his own party insofar as these people want these things. They voted for him because of the very fact that they can subsidize their education. So backlash is likely to only be from Republicans. But it also means that the very foundations of the Democratic Party and Biden administration are aligned with these very incentives. That is to say, even if we buy the absolute worst case of government that it has blown up catastrophically, insofar as the tenets of the party, like these things are the tenets of the party, it's unlikely that the government, like Biden administration as a whole, would regret it. Government is just Biden time before that inevitable loss, no pun intended, ballot to opposition.
We thank the Leader of Opposition for that speech. We now call on the Deputy Prime Minister. Here.
Assuming I'm visible.
Oh yeah, you are visible and audible.
Perfect. Starting my speech. 3, 2, 1. Panel politics is a game of perception. That means if you give your opponent a chance to showcase that you've done something wrong, especially at the position that Biden is at which you're literally at crossroads, you're marginally winning the actual election that you did win. When you lost midterm elections, you're probably going to lose a lot of swing states looking at how Ron DeSantis is going forward with his election campaign. This is a bad step you've taken. Why is it important? One, I think you should have gone forward and in the counterfactual, spend this money, one, in probably better reforms that don't directly look like giving off money, especially at a point of time. People have lost their jobs. It's an economic recession. People have faced extreme harms and job loss post the pandemic. It is part of this debate. This debate literally happens in USA where people have lost their jobs post the pandemic. It's important. But also, when you go forward and say that, we've given off these funds to a large amount of people who are accessing this, these are funds being given to people who've already had the education. Note the nuance panel. These are people who've already received education, not people who are going forward to receive this education. That means extra job creation doesn't happen at a point in time on op. It's literally happening already. That means these people already had the education that they wanted. They were already probably having jobs, but probably the lack of jobs defied them from actually going forward and earning back this money and paying back loans themselves. Note panel. Who are probably people who are accessing these loans? This is important. And this directly takes out their idea on, why Republican backlash exists for education. One, I think people who are racial minorities, people who are already struggling with their income in terms of being racial minorities, structurally being opposed from like catering to the system, were people who are like probably people who are getting these loans. This is important panel because Republicans don't go forward majoritarianly to go forward and access higher education universities. That means Republican voter base is unlikely to be the ones who are accessing this. Their idea that, education is uniform is incorrect. But also, the idea is that if this is such a small amount of money, its effectual change that you're going forward and creating with the number of people that you can affect is minimal. That means the funding that you do give can be portrayed in a negative manner that it is being right now. What are the backlash that you're getting? One, it's seen as redundant spending at a time of economic crisis. That means you're already being blamed for the recession. You're being blamed for the excessive spending during the pandemic. You're being blamed for like reaching the debt ceiling right now. This is a regressing motion. That means we need to see what harms have already happened in the past and evaluate them now. That means a lot of this backlash is happening at this point of time. You're seen as a tipping point of the recession because you're seen as, even if you aren't literally the tipping point, it's the perception of, you going forward and spending in unnecessary means and manners, which is going forward and making the people believe that they won't receive their jobs. That means it's important what perception you have to get re-elected. I think the Biden administration primarily wants to get re-elected, and at the point of time, you're literally losing your perception. The red voters are increasing in a majority, and swing voters are swaying towards their side. You're losing this debate. But also, why is in education the most primary thing on which you win swing voters? That means core democratic voters will probably still likely to vote for you because they literally hate all the tax reforms and economic reforms that red parties do bring. That means it's unclear why it's a tipping point for your voter base to go forward and shift somewhere else. But it's important to note that a lot of swing voters go forward and tip on their side because you're losing the midterm election. This is an important panel because if this had to have some sort of effect, it would have in the 2022 mid-election. That means at a point in time, voter ratings and people increasing in ratings and in the perception of Biden did not increase. That means factually, it's unclear how you're able to increase this voter base or increase this perception right now. How would you have been able to do this? One, if you would have gone forward and sided with the Republican parties in terms of how they want to go forward and create jobs, one, you wouldn't be receiving active backlash from Ron DeSantis saying that, these people, Democrats allow foreigners to steal your jobs. They allow for more people to come in, people who don't have proper access, people who aren't true Americans to get money, but also steal away your jobs. At a point of time, literally real Americans are losing their jobs. This is the manifesto that the Reds are riding on and winning. This is an important panel because if you aren't able to go forward and create some sort of harms to this or at least mitigate this, you lose. Why are short-term incentives would have been capable to solve if you had the money? One, you are incapable of spending excessive amounts of money right now to get short-term impacts at a point in time. Your long-term impact didn't come about. That means till now, none of the Biden administration's impacts are seen as positive. This looks like pulling out of the Afghan. This looks like you not being able to curb COVID. This looks like you reaching the debt crisis without having to raise the debt ceiling. These are all harms that you aren't able to solve. How would you have been able to do this? To solve this? One, short-term spending in terms of how you're able to create jobs and impact on our side would have been possible if you would have had this cash on hand then. You aren't able to, one, because Republican backlash in terms of you spending excessive amounts of money, but also debt ceiling having been reached. That means you're not able to access more amounts of money in the short term to mitigate all of the harms that you have made already, because now you're seen as an excessive spender and you're not seen as someone who can handle money properly. And at a point in time, literally everyone in the US economy, everyone in the population faces severe crunches in terms of their jobs, in terms of how much money they have, in terms of the loans that they're getting. You're seen as a person who's taking away money directly from their pocket. This is the media hypocrisy that will be used by the opposition, that will be used by the Republicans. And if you aren't able to tackle this, you lose at all, because you would have had this money if you wouldn't have gone forward and done this. If you would have sided with the Republicans and gone forward and passed probably job creation reforms, you would have allowed for a bipartisan support. That means you could have swung a lot of voters towards your own side, but also you could have garnered a lot more your own voters in terms of instilling the factor that you can also go forward and just not the point of education is you being able to access a better job. At the point in time you can secure better jobs for your own voter base. I think the utility of that education in and of itself falls. At the point in time, can't go forward and mitigate all of the harms that already exist because they don't have the money to do so. They actively go forward and fail face first into all of these harms that the Republican Party faces. But also, a lot of funding that you probably require for going forward and getting re-elected in terms of your campaigning, etc., is seen as waste now. That means once you've gone forward and infected a very small amount of people, no panel, it's unclear if this is a small amount of money, how many people are you truly able to probably affect? But also, if it's so small, then why is it a tipping point in terms of how you're catering to your people? Because a lot of people must have had their applications rejected in terms of them having going forward and applied for it as well. That means people feel rejected. People feel dejected that they didn't get the representation from the government that they voted in. At a point in time that happens, you probably have active backlash from your own voter base as well. I think all of these are problems that OP has to deal with. This is a small amount of money, but the perception of it, and it's bombarded to you by opposition. It's unclear the effect you have on your own constituencies because you aren't able to affect all of them, but actually leave out a huge chunk of them. At that point of time, opposition loses.
We thank the Deputy Prime Minister for that speech. Let's now call on the Deputy Leader of Opposition. Here.
Hi, can you hear and see me?
Oh yeah, you are audible and visible.
Okay. Hi, my name is Shireen Shiha. I will take yours in the chat. Please don't unmute. Thanks. Starting my speech in... Sorry, starting my... Can I borrow my phone? My phone's dead. My bad, sorry. Thanks. Okay. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. I think the reason why government already loses the debate is because of the characterization they do not prove. Because they say we're dealing with a small amount of the budget, which is true, but it somehow has the implication of being a huge perception bias, where it's seen as this multi-million or multi-billion dollar, which it is, but a huge part of the budget that is causing the recession and the rising debt ceiling of the US. Insofar as they don't prove why, because it's such a small amount, it is therefore the tipping point of why people seem to hate the Biden administration for its mismanagement of funds. I don't think they can claim that on our side. I have two things I want to call out before I get into the crux of my speech. The first thing I want to question is whether or not backlash itself is something that the Biden administration wants to care about. Because I think we have to remember it's an active debate, and therefore we need to consider whether backlash is something that the Biden administration feels like they can take on. I think given the bipartisan or the partisan nature of the US political scene itself, it's probable that Biden administration is used to facing the backlash from Republican Party. They're used to all of the media scoundering or propaganda against them by the far-right media that always condemns whatever they do, regardless if it's a good policy or not. They're used to things like filibustering by the Republicans. They're used to things like disagreements within Congress. I don't see why one policy that is leading to the backlash from Republicans that is likely going to exist across all of the other socialist policies or expensive policies that Biden is pushing is going to be the reason why they're going to lose out on the primaries or the polls in the next term. I think insofar as that is the nature of the US political scene, I don't think it's something that's contentious within the round itself, or at least it's not the primary concern of the Biden administration. The second thing I want to call out is the slight contradiction in their case, because they say the counterfactual that they want is to make more jobs. But obviously, to make more jobs, you're probably going to have expenditure as a government. You're going to have to spend monies on government subsidies to incentivize the creation of jobs. You're going to have to give things like tax relief to also incentivize SMEs from rising up on the ground, which also come at the expense of the government. Which means if you're saying we're getting shit for having a welfare policy that is costing the government money, but your counterfactual is also a welfare policy that is costing the government money, you're also going to have to deal with that on the same counterfactual you're defending, which means the debate must operate assuming that the backlash is not significant in and of itself. I'm going to answer three things in my speech. Significantly, all three ideas that I'm going to discuss are the incentives of the Biden administration that are most proximate to it within the short term. I'm also going to engage in the idea of the re-election within 2024 that I think they're not going to win on anyway. The first thing I want to discuss is the public image of the administration and whether or not they're able to retain a sense of credibility in the future. Because the logic they have in the other team is relatively funny, because they say people are scrutinizing Biden now and are blaming them for the recession and the hitting of the debt ceiling. So the solution to the problem is therefore to not do any welfare policy and to regret the welfare policy that we have in place to help people on the ground. I don't think that intuitively is the reason why people are going to want to hate the administration, especially when they're pushing for policies that help people uplift themselves from poverty. Because the people who are most hurt by the recession are those who are poor, are the working to middle income who can't be able to afford to pay back their loans, who are the most vulnerable upon recessions, which means the loan relief is likely going to appeal to those people, and they're not going to want to blame the administration saying this loan is specifically why, or this forgiveness is specifically why we're in the recession. First thing I want to discuss on the public image. I think the pushback we get from government bench is that people think the Biden administration is causing the recession. I think it's intuitive to think that it's not true. Because if you want to say that this minute part of the budget is what people perceive as the highest cost of the national budget, things like expenditure on the US military complex, for example, or just random things that the US doesn't have to spend money on are likely also going to come under the same umbrella of scrutiny, and therefore individuals are not just going to point to welfare policies as the sole reason, specifically because secondly, they see welfare policies and the expenditure upon that as necessary. They don't blame the military complex to the same extent as they blame healthcare policies, because they understand that it's going to go back to the people on the ground, which is why people don't see it as an unnecessary expenditure and don't see it as taking money out of people's pockets, because that tax money goes back to the poorest people who require it to relieve their loans to pay back their education. But the second pushback we get is, oh, people will vote for Biden anyway. I think if that's true, it just cements the loyalty even more on our side, because it means we're going to show them a sense of credibility and the fact that we deliver our promises. Insofar as the manifesto that Biden relied on upon his campaign was the fact that loan forgiveness is going to be achievable within his tenure. But the second people that we're able to attract within our side of the house are young swing voters. And I want to note that it doesn't really matter if these individuals directly benefit from the loan forgiveness, because the speaker before me tries to assume that the only people that are going to like the policy are those who get the forgiveness in the first place. I don't think that's true, because Because insofar as you set the precedent of the Biden administration or the US government in general, setting policies that are able to help you in your education and give you welfare and a significant amount of loan debt or a debt forgiveness, that is able to help you in your financial situation in the future, is when you're able to showcase a level of hope towards people on the ground that I can trust you to make policy. I can vote for you again because I trust you in the near future to also churn out similar policies that help me on the ground, which is why young people generally combine themselves around the policy because they see it as precedent for a good future. But thirdly, the fact that educated voters generally swing left is also necessarily why education is specifically something the Biden administration has an incentive to cater to, specifically when it comes to securing a voter base for the next election. I'm going to take a PR now before I go on.
Are these new voters that you somehow get are the primary people who will vote for you in 2024, or people who have lost their jobs and see you spending on education reform?
Look, I don't think that FPR is even contentious because one, people vote regardless. I think the fact that they're voting more for you means you have a higher chance of getting past the primaries or the election in 2024. I think that's fair. But secondly, I don't see why you prove the link of this specific policy being the reason why people are jobless, because presumably the recession is caused by things like, I don't know, a worldwide pandemic, or things like tax systems being not effective in the US, or things like inflation, or things like the expenditure on the military budget. I don't know why you prove the link of people suddenly pointing towards this policy saying that is why I'm not getting my jobs, but that's also why I'm being able to have a loan that's forgiven in my student debt. That link does not make sense. But the second argument I want to discuss, and the specific incentive of the Biden administration, is how it's able to boost the economy. Because I think this is where we flip the argument on the other team to say that we don't create jobs and we end up harming the economy because we spend so much more. Number one, I think the relative understanding of the problem is that when you have a huge loan to pay back in terms of your student debt, which is a crisis problem that's in the US right now, as Jadon already characterizes to you, a lot of individuals cannot engage in things that are good for the economy because they simply don't have the disposable income necessary to do so. They can't invest in startups or invest in the stock market or do anything that spends money to boost the circulation of money within the economy because all of that money goes back to repaying their student debts. When they're forgiven for these things, it means they have more disposable income to use in the general economic scheme, which obviously stimulates the growth of the economy, specifically in the recession or the post-recession area that government wants to defend. The problem in the government case then is they just assume that the money that has gone towards education could have been used to things like creating jobs. I think one, that trade-off isn't proven in the speeches before me, they can't do it in whip. But secondly, the fact that education is also likely going to create jobs because you have a more professional and educated labor force also means that you're able to access a section of the market that is otherwise not going to be accessed, insofar as these individuals wouldn't have been able to access those things to begin with. For all of those reasons, ballot to opposition.
We thank the Deputy Leader of Opposition for that speech. We now call on the government whip. Hear, hear.
Hope I'm audible.
Yeah, you are audible now.
Okay. POIs in the chat box. I'll start in 3. Just a second. Start in 3, 2, 1. I want to make a couple of things awash before I move on to the actual case. I think the first thing is on backlash. I think the problem with this debate is that opposition never explains as to why people are going to move out and are going to stop supporting Biden after a job reform policy is executed, because presumably the people that have garnered the benefits of this educational policy are still going to vote for Biden. But the second thing to note on that is that if it's just on perceptual value, I still think that Biden is going to reap the benefits of the perceptual value on our side as well, even after implementing the job policy after this. But the second thing to note on that is that jobs are already very less in the US market, or rather in USA right now, and most people need liquid money. Saatvik tells you explicitly why that is true, because of how many people have lost their jobs due to the recession, due to the tech recession, due to like the other things such as the Ukraine-Russia war and things like that, which means that people need immediacy of solutions, and that's why people are prioritizing jobs. But the third thing to note on that is that kids are probably going to vote, if they are as significant of a vote base as opposition wants to claim, only after they see tangible changes, which means that things like infrastructure needs to be built, things like trickle down needs to happen, things like you reaping the benefits of this solution has to happen. If you don't see those things happening, then people are going to probably vote on perceptual value. If that is true, then people are going to vote on perceptual value on both sides of the house, which means that there is no real tipping point that government or rather opposition can have in this debate at that point. But secondly, I think it's hard to implement this policy at any point of time because it's going to receive a significant amount of pushback from Republicans. On a comparative, why do we have lesser backlash? I think the first thing to note on that is Republicans have significantly focused on creation of jobs and making sure that more people have like access to jobs. This is because of the narratives that Trump also like spread during his time on the time as president, because of things like how anti-Mexico narratives were also spread, how the shock with recession was also prioritized upon as Trump's policy, which means that Republicans for a long period of time have focused on like job creation and job changes, which means that at the point of time Republicans have active backlash against like the job creation policy. We think that Republicans are only going to look hypocritical, which means that there is no real reason for Republicans to push back against this policy. But the second thing to note on that is a bit of a contradiction coming from opposition, which means that if the money required for this policy is in fact so small, then I don't think opposition can claim huge benefits of things like a lot of people being able to access this education, because presumably the amount of money that students can now have or can now take as loans is also extremely less in nature, which means that at best this policy is going to be seen as something that is absolutely tokenistic in nature, but at worst it's going to be seen as an even more ineffective policy that is being pushed by Biden, which means that gov case largely, or rather op case largely falls out of this debate because of two reasons. One, op is not able to explain as to why this becomes the tipping point for Biden to win this election. But two, I just don't think like education is going to be as important as job creation. There are multiple reasons why. I think the narrative in US currently is that people can still access education through online websites. Things like Coursera exist, which means that even like universities such as Harvard are also promoting free courses such as CS50, which means that people to a certain extent can probably still access education or high quality education. What then becomes the tipping point? I think most people want to prioritize vocational training because then that becomes the only unique way in which you can increase the amount of income that you have, but also increase the amount of spending that you can have, which means that there's a unique focus on making sure that you have more jobs, because education can be accessed through other avenues such as online education, such as like other student funds that already exist in US and things like that, which means that at that point of time jobs become a unique tipping point in this debate, because that is something that opposition can't claim at any point. But the second thing to note on this is that people are becoming even more protectionist in nature, which means that there's a constant fear of another crisis happening. There's the recession that has happened, there's the Ukraine war that has happened, which means that people are fearing the fact that they might not be able to economically sustain themselves. This is one of the reasons why people want to focus so much on jobs or the ability to have liquid money, because they want to make sure that they don't have to focus or go through like the same problems as the ones that they have faced. But the third thing to note on that is that US is currently facing a huge problem in terms of the number of jobs that they can offer, which means that the number of educated people that exist within US is only increasing in nature, but the number of jobs that they can access through this education is not increasing at the same rate as the number of people that are getting educated. This is crucially important because even if you can provide education to most people, they end up becoming jobless at any point of time, which means that on their side of the house, you probably have even more jobless people increasing, or the number of people that blame the government increases because they simply can't access jobs even after accessing education. I think this is where we become extremely crucial to this debate on two counts. One, we think that we have higher bipartisan support, which which means that it's easier to implement our policy because red states want to implement this policy and take some credit themselves. But the second thing to note on that is that the red states just look hypocritical, and red people, like the red party, just looks hypocritical if they don't implement the policy in the best way. But the second thing to note on this is that Biden probably wants to ensure that that there's a higher number of voter turnout for the number of people that vote for Biden. I think the best way to do this on a short term is to make sure that more people have more money in their hands, because the educational policy is going to take much more time because of A, infrastructural problems, B, gestation period. The number of people that, like the young voters that opposition claims, are probably only going to be able to give votes only after a certain period of time. POI, sure.
You have a contradiction in your case. If red states don't want to be seen as hypocritical, they will support Biden's initiative for free healthcare and education because those are things that people like.
This is very simple. I think red states want to prioritize both things. I think most parties want to, but it's what you push more. I think red states would probably want to push more for push more for jobs, because that is something that Trump has done in the past as well. It's the precedents that they have, which means that at the point of time they oppose something like job creation, they just look even more hypocritical. I think this is where I think our counterfactual becomes crucially important because of two reasons. One is on time. I think it's a time of crisis, which means that at the point of time you prioritize education, it just shows the things that the Biden administration is prioritizing. The problem with that is that it shows where the Biden administration priority lies, because it shows that the Biden administration has not been able to identify the meat of the problem. On our side of the house, I think being able to identify the meat of the problem and trying to cater to the meat of the problem more is more important, because it gives more trust to the people. But the second thing to note on that is that there's a severe time crunch. We think on their side of the house, even if we end up garnering voters, these voters are only going to come after 2024. On our side of the house, we want to make sure that more people come in more immediately, which means on time we make sure that more people end up voting for our own cause, which means that there's a higher propensity of Biden staying in power, which is why we're very proud to propose.
We thank the government whip for that speech. Let's now call on the opposition whip. Here.
Am I visible and audible?
Yes, you're visible and audible.
Give me a second. Okay. POIs verbally. I won't even be looking at the screen mostly. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. The biggest reason why government cannot win this debate is within the DPM speech itself, because they say that people will hate the Biden administration because they feel betrayed within their own analysis. This feeds into the analysis from Jadon's speech that no government speaker has responded to at all, which was that the Biden administration had a direct incentive to fulfill the promises within their primaries, within the elections in which they've run to. They never engaged with the truth of this argument, but we impacted significantly. What were these impacts? One, we say it's a prerequisite to all incentives that the government team concedes to when they talk about staying in power and backlash, which are all arguments that operate on the metric that the Biden administration has a strong incentive to stay within power. We tell you the point in time where you don't even follow the promises that you made, the Biden administration is unlikely to ever win again. This was all within Jadon's speech, because the point in time where you don't, it doesn't matter what you preach. It doesn't matter what's in your manifesto. People don't feel confident that what they're voting in is going to be the manifestation that's going to come out in the primaries or in the main election. When this is true, and they never engage with this or even try and assert otherwise, they cannot make a case within this metric. They have fundamentally lost it from the LO-DPM exchange, and we have already won this debate. Few pieces of extraneous responses. One, backlash as an argument from government. I think Shireen has done enough work to show you why it's unlikely that the backlash is pinpointed specifically to this policy is something that is so big in this debate. Like, yeah, there might be some people who think that this is the specific policy that's causing all this crisis, but it's unlikely the point in time the PM spends so much time talking about all the other bigger issues like the Ukraine crisis and the Afghanistan crisis. I don't know why they're pointing to this issue in the first place. But also, even if the totality of backlash is something that is a net bad, it's not impacted from one single policy. Government cannot impact their case into the totality of backlash from this marginal increase from that policy. Don't credit it to them. But also this weird thing about people losing their jobs.
At best, it's a wash. And I want to make it clear that this was never our argument. It was their argument. So when government whip says it's a wash, they just lose an argument from that. But then I just understand that if it were the case that people, oh no, I wanted a job, but I'm not getting it. Some people are going to be, oh no, I wanted education, I'm not getting it. I'm unclear as to why one group is greater than the other. If they wanted this argument to win them the debate, they needed to put some legwork into it. But even if you work the numbers, we win. But don't let the stray response from DPM say that these individuals have already gotten education and aren't getting any benefit. Because one, this policy works for future students. If you want to study now, you can, because the prices of student loans are going to be halved, meaning more individuals are going to be able to get education in the first place. That response doesn't cater towards the actual manifestation of the policy. But $20,000, unlike what the government wants you to believe, is a lot for these individuals on the ground who can't even afford to go to education, and they don't even have that much saved up. 600,000 individuals is a significant amount of people. They don't want to engage this. I'll take you later. But lastly, it also sets a precedence. This is something they never engaged with, because we say, one, the point in time where more jobs are going to come from more education, which is literally like what they want for some reason. Because if you want to have job creation, you need to educate these people in the first place. You want them to move into higher skilled jobs. When we get this benefit towards the economy, it is likely that this is going to set a precedent for further investment into the reduction of student loans and the reduction of prices to enter university, meaning that this will have huge impacts in the long run. They didn't get it. But the best response they have here, though, is that you can, the way you get jobs is through education for some reason. So the only way for their policy counterfactual to work needs people to get education, which is why I tell you, we tell you in Jadon's speech itself, it is unlikely that their counterfactual is even viable, because I don't see how somehow they have the assertion standing that they have even more capital to make a better policy or a longer lasting policy on their side. But lastly, the knife within their whip speech takes them out. Why? Because they say red states care for the things that people feel at the end of the day and the tangible impacts. I don't see any distinction that was significantly made between jobs and education. I don't see why these things are exclusive within the debate. On to the first metric of this debate, another one that they did not engage with at all, which was that the Biden administration, at the end of the day, wants to fulfill socialist incentives. Why? This even works within the most extreme characterization of their side. Because even if we do buy the characterization that Biden is losing and he's having such a difficult an implied attempt, I'll take you near 6, an implied attempt at them trying to frame out the first and main metric in this debate. We say that politicians are not just power hungry. The whole precedence here is that they want to be able to pass policies that they believe are good. They never engage with this because on their side, the government, Biden administration is only passing policies that are going to be okay with the Republicans. We say at that point in time, they are never going to be able to fulfill the incentive that they have because of this idea of backlash that they never mechanized as impacted at the end of the day. They aren't fulfilling this incentive. Why is this debate winning? Notice one, they never try and frame it out of the debate, but it's prerequisite to all the analysis, because the only reason why they would want to stay in power in the first place, even if you do for some reason credit that to government, is because they want to put in policies that benefit socialist agendas at the end of the day. We've given you precedence for it in Jadon's speech as well. They never engaged with this pure eye.
Even if you're able to create a precedent with the minimal number of people that you are truly affecting, why is this precedent more important than probably the urgency of getting re-elected in 2024?
I mean, one thing, you never prove why job creation is going to work. If you want to attack our mechanization and say that, oh, this education isn't going to bring people at the end of the day, I'm going to do it. One, you see, when you give people student loan deductions, it's an immediate benefit. They feel that immediately. When you create jobs in this nebulous way that's absolutely not mechanized in any of their speeches, don't fill in the gaps for them panel, they never say why this is something that's going to be immediate. Maybe the government says, oh, we're going to have more jobs in the future. But the point in time where it's not as immediate as the policy on our side, it is unlikely that's going to factor into the 2024 election, which is just around the corner, as on our side. It is unlikely that significant amounts of jobs are created on your side within 4 years. But even if they had to go through education. So no matter what, it's going to require more capital, which is unlikely, and it's going to take a longer time, which means we win on that metric as well. Lastly, on the voter base, which they wanted to bring into this debate, they say we should benefit those outside the core voter base in this debate. One, why are they suddenly going to vote for you? If they talked about how red states are so loyal, I don't see why slightly focusing on them when the Republicans are going to fully have their focus on them means they're going to vote for you. No mechanization here. I think you shouldn't engage on them because, yeah, they just aren't going to vote for you at the end of the day. Focus on the people that you promised to help. Why is it that they say that, oh, these people will vote for you anyway? No, There's a thing called voter apathy, which I'm sure everyone here knows. And we already engaged with this. There are a lot of poor people and minorities don't vote. The point in time they aren't engaged with in politics. They feel that policies don't care for them. This happens greater on their side. The point in time where you don't even fulfill the promises to them, these people just aren't going to vote in the first place because what's the fucking point at the end of the day? But lastly, we argue that the shifting demographics, when we have greater amounts of education, moves people into voting blue. Now you have to vote opposition. Proud to oppose.
We thank the opposition whip for that speech. To end the opposition half, we now call an op reply.
Sorry, you can see me?
Yeah, you are visible and audible.
Okay, 1 second. Okay, starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. My reply speech is going to be very simple. I'm going to walk you through the case you've heard on government bench and then walk you through our case and show you why we have clearly won the debate. I'm just going to point out 3 things in the overall flow of the government bench's case to show why they lose. The first thing is they at no point in their speeches explain what a retrospective world absent of this policy is likely going to look like. Because the only slight hint of it we get it throughout the speeches is that the money probably would have gone to creating jobs. One, they don't prove why education and jobs are distinct because we've already explained why education leads to jobs and incentivizes high-skilled jobs as well. But second, if they have a problem with the government spending money on welfare, which is education, I don't know why their government doesn't have a problem spending money on welfare in the form of jobs as well, which means at best, they say we want jobs, but they don't prove it. The second thing I want to call out in the case on their side is just the uncertain demand of education of whether they want it or not. Because we first heard that they don't want people spending money or they don't want the Biden administration spending money on welfare because it's going to be called out as expenditure, but their counterfactual requires expenditure as well. Second is the whip speaker says education is necessary for jobs because he cites things like Coursera and online courses that people can use to learn skills that they can use to get jobs, which means if you agree with everything government bench says down to the whip, they want jobs that are educated, which means this policy is directly in line with the necessities of the economy that probably Biden wants to abide by as well. But the third thing and the third reason why they lose out on the debate is the only thing left standing then is the idea of backlash. Because the premise of this argument is the backlash against the administration for using such money on like welfare for education is going to bite him in the back in the 2024 primaries or re-election. I think first, we don't prove a tipping point on their side of the house because we told you that the bipartisan and the polarized nature of US politics necessitates backlash all the time. Media corporations on right and the left will always shit on each other. They will always argue and disagree within the cabinets of the House. And so it's unlikely why this is the specific policy that's going to take down the entire democratic institution run by Biden. But secondly, I don't know why backlash doesn't happen in the comparative as well, because they want to spend money on things like jobs, which they say is bipartisan, which A, they don't prove, but B, comes at the cost of state capital, which is the primary reason why they're saying we are losing. Because if they say we are losing because the state is spending money, but they are winning because the state is spending money, but on different things, the reason they lose is the same. They're spending money, which means backlash is a non-issue. At best, if it happens on our side, I'm trading it off because the Biden administration deals with a ton of shit on media every single day. What are the 3 things we told you on our side to win the debate? We gave you 3 simple incentives that cement why this is likely in the interest of the Biden administration for now and the long term. The first is on public image. We gave you 2 very simple mechanisms to secure why the Biden administration needs to retain the policy and doesn't regret the policy because of his image. 1, it is something that he held within his manifesto during his election campaign in 2020, which means not doing the policy or just not fulfilling it within his 4-year tenure would have made him look untrustworthy insofar as he doesn't want to fulfill his promises to the people, which means if what they say is true in government, that he's under immense scrutiny for already failing in Afghanistan or failing in a recession, this not doing it and regretting the PSLF is another failure on his part, which would have worsened his public image if he hadn't done it anyway. But the second mechanism we gave you is like prospective in the future, because young people and educated people in general are going to want to like the policy. They don't see it as stealing state funds because the money is going back to them, which means they're not having their money stolen for some reason, but it's also going to give them a prospect of a better hope for the future because people in the US like welfare and they've been demanding for things like free education and free healthcare along those same lines, which means the prospect of the US government doing these things under Biden is a good precedent for the future, because even if the number of people getting the loans forgiveness now is small, it is a prototype they can use to cite success for, and therefore increase the budget for in the future, which gives people hope, which is why people vote again for Biden specifically in the next election, because he can say, I gave you this policy last term, I can give it to you more in the next term. That's why the number of votes he gets is significant and why it's an interest that he wants to at least take on us of the House. But the second incentive we give you is just the fact that the Biden administration has incentives want to boost the economy by virtue of allowing individuals to have loan forgiveness, to have disposable income for other things that don't necessitate them spending all their money on university. And thirdly, socialist incentive. The primary ideology of the Biden administration was to increase welfare and to somehow lean the welfare policies of the state towards helping people on the ground. And insofar as this policy at its very least does that, we win the debate.
We thank the opposition reply for that speech. To end this debate, we now call in government reply. Hear, hear.
All right, perfectly audible and visible.
Yep.
Starting my speech, 3, 2, 1. Panel, trust us and your notes, because if opposition constantly tells you that we're contradicting and knifing ourselves, it's untrue. They're trying to push it forward. 1, even if you don't, I'll prove to you why you do. 1, there's no positive case on op. They never prove to you, even if they do an op whip and tell you all of the benefits that do come about. It's unclear what their positive is, because even if they're going forward and like setting a precedent, I think the urgency that we set on from 1, losing the midterm elections, but also Ron DeSantis actively utilizing the media to scrutinize the left in terms of how they're utilizing public taxpayer money, and the perception of you utilizing this money at a point of time there's a crunch of jobs, not education. Panel, you go forward and get harmed significantly. It's important, panel, to note the nuance here. I think Himan tells you that if education is the end goal that people actually want, they can access it through cheaper means. It isn't a contradiction by saying that, oh, education is something that we always want to push at the Biden administration. It's the nuance. But also, at the point in time you have an education, what do you want to do with it? You don't sit as an Einstein, educated, unemployed. You want employment. At the point in time, a massive scale of people is unemployed, sitting without any ability to go forward and earn money sustainably. It's unclear why just waiving off some loans also for a very specific amount of people is any benefit. Because if this was true, why wouldn't you go forward and waive all of their loans and like utilize that? It's unclear what benefit and the scale of the benefit that op does want to claim. But also, they say that, oh, this is something that people have at all points of time wanted, and this is something that's important, and reform and like probably study loans are something that people want. If that is true, it's unclear why these people don't go forward and vote for Biden, because Republicans are never going to do this. This is important, panel, because if this is the primary voting metric that OP wants to set, that people have and the younger future generation would have, it's unclear why the Republicans would anyways get that vote. This debate is about the Biden administration, not the 2028 leftist Biden administration. That means the urgency of wanting to get re-elected post you having lost a lot of negative and getting a lot of negative PR exists for the 2024 elections. That means the media is hogging you constantly, asking you why you spend a free amount of money rather than creating jobs. Why is creating jobs different from probably leading on from education? We give this to you from our first speech. Republicans want jobs, not education. That means people want to go forward and create utility within the state in terms of people having jobs, rather than just going forward and going for the preliminary thing of it, that's education. And that is the reason why Republicans would have sided with you. This was on my speech and Saatvik's as to why you wouldn't have received as much backlash from the Republicans if you would have gone forward and created jobs, even if it would have required a larger amount of money, because that was the need of the hour at that point of time when people were losing jobs. People weren't losing out on education because they had other means of getting that education. Panel, note, this is a very simple debate. If they say that precedent is the largest impact that they have, it's unclear why this precedent comes forward and gets enacted immediately for Biden. But we tell you that the urgency that's created right now, because of the precedent that this set in terms of how media is portraying it, in terms of perception that Ron DeSantis goes forward and Trump goes forward and shows that, oh, the leftists are job stealers within the country, is important. If you wouldn't have done it, you wouldn't be facing all of this backlash. You would have probably created better reforms. You would have probably created anti-bullying incentives. That means there were other means of creating all of that benefit. We tell you it's most likely job creation. That means you get swing voters on our side as well who probably lost their job. That means it's important, panel, to note who is affecting more number of people when you're giving out freebies to educational people who otherwise anyways would have voted for you if it was the most important thing to them, or probably creating more jobs and switching swing voters who didn't vote for you in the midterm election. This is important, panel, because it's unclear what their impact is, their characterization is faulty, and their framing in and of itself is a lie.
We thank the government reply for that speech, and that ends the debate. Debaters, feel free to cross the house, and congratulations on finishing Octo finals. A couple of announcements. So me and the rest of the panel will be like discussing here about our decision. So if I may ask everybody to leave the room. And I believe that